Hi there, folks. Today we're looking at observational studies and experiments. And the first thing we're going to do is define these two things. What are the differences between an observational study versus an experiment? What separates the two? And then we'll start to look at some of the components of these things, the variables involved, treatment groups versus control groups. And we'll also look at confounding and what that is, okay? So the first thing here is let's look at the difference between these two things. So an observational study is when we observe individuals and measure the variables, okay? We don't attempt to influence the results in any way, shape, or form, okay? And that's slightly different from an experiment. With an experiment, we're deliberately imposing a treatment. In other words, we're trying something, we're having those individuals do something or take something or participate in something, and then measuring the response to that thing that we're having them do, okay? And so when we think about observational studies, the observational study is more like, hey, we are just measuring what is, okay? We are measuring what exists in its natural form, okay? We are not attempting to influence it in any way. We're not trying to get certain results. We are just taking the data that is presented to us and collecting it as is. All right. We are not doing anything to influence that. Okay. So collecting what is. And the experiment is when we're trying to get some kind of response. All right. We won't always get the response that we're after. We might be testing some new educational technology, and we might think it's going to increase test scores, and it turns out decreases test scores. Okay. And so we won't necessarily get the response we want, but we're after a certain response, and we're kind of imposing a treatment. We're giving them something to do or take or try in order to see how it affects the results, okay? So again, observational study, we are taking what is, what's in its natural form, we're just collecting the data, okay? We are simply observing. That's why it's called an observational study. And then an experiment, we are literally conducting an experiment. We are imposing some kind of treatment and seeing what the response is, okay? Within these things, we have two variables that we look at. We look at the explanatory variable and the response variable. The explanatory variable explains or predicts the change in the response, and the response variable is what we actually observe, is what we're collecting data on in terms of the effect of the treatment, okay? And, when we think about the response and the explanatory variables, when we look at them from the perspective of data, the explanatory variable happens first and the response happens later, okay? But when we identify these things, I almost always identify the response variable first and say, okay, what data did we collect? What did we observe? What was the effect? What did we see happen? And then we ask ourselves, what might explain that happening, okay? And, with an experiment, there's typically a direct correlation here in terms of, okay, this is the response variable, this is the explanatory variable. What we did, the explanatory variable is a lot of times the treatment. It's what we imposed. And then the response variable is the data we got out of that, okay? With an observational study, the best we can do, we can't really necessarily say there's a cause and effect with an observational study. The best we can do is say, hey, there's a correlation here which might warrant us to do an experiment. Okay, so in an observational study, we observe, that's our response variable. And then we might look at, okay, what was this linked to as the explanatory variable? Where is the connection here, okay, that may have caused this? We can't say for sure. And that's one of the other big differences between observational experimental. With experiments, we can draw conclusions. We can say that, yes, this was a cause and effect relationship. But with an observational study, we can't necessarily draw conclusions. What we do is we kind of link things and say, hey, there's some kind of correlation here. Maybe we should investigate this further with an experiment, okay? And confounding, which we'll talk about later, is one of the big reasons why, okay? For example, if I look at something like this, it says, determine if the example is an observational study or an experiment. And then we're going to determine what the explanatory variable is and what the response variable is. Okay, so researchers in a sleep lab recorded the brain waves of college students while sleeping. The researchers found that students who used their cell phones within an hour of sleeping had higher brain activity. And so first of all, the question is this observational experimental? Did we just observe what was happening and take notes and took the data in as it was? Or did we impose a treatment? So we're talking about this use of cell phones. does it say anywhere in here that we told some students to use their cell phones and told other students not to use their cell phones? And the answer is no. There was no treatment imposed. We just observed that, hey, some of these kids used their phones before they went to sleep, and they had higher brain activity. Okay. And so this is an observational study because we are simply observing and collecting the data on what we see happening. Okay. And so we observed that some students used their phone within an hour of sleeping. And we observed that there was higher brain activity in those particular students. Okay. So this is an observational study. We did not make them use their phones within an hour of sleeping. So we are simply observing what happened naturally. Okay. And we talk about explanatory and response. The response variable, again, if I identify that first, it's a little bit easier. I look at it and say, okay, the response variable this time, what we saw happen is we saw higher brain activity in some of these students. So that would be the higher brain activity. And then we ask ourselves, okay, what might have caused those students to have higher brain activity? And we believe, based on this link here, that maybe it was the cell phones that caused that higher brain activity. So we'll say phone use over here. Okay. And again, we can't draw a conclusion. We can't say there's a cause and effect relationship here because this is simply an observational study. All we saw was that there is some kind of correlation here that might warrant an experiment to be conducted. Okay. We can't say that the phone use caused the higher brain activity. We just observed that there might be a link here. And so, yeah, we might want to conduct an experiment that investigates that. This one, when we look at something like this guy, it says researchers in another group provided students with an herbal supplement and found that it lowered excess brain activity. So now we are having a group take an herbal supplement. Okay. So we are imposing some kind of treatment. We are having them do something. We're having them take something, and we're monitoring what the results of taking that might be. Okay. And so this one is an experiment because we are imposing that treatment. So this is an experiment. And once again, we are measuring brain activity. So the response variable is that lower brain activity that we are measuring. And then if we ask ourselves what might have caused that lower brain activity, we would say, well, we imposed a certain treatment, and the treatment we imposed that we believe lowered that brain activity was this herbal supplement. Okay. And in this one, depending on how well our study was conducted, and if we did all the right things, we might be able to say there's a cause and effect here, that herbal supplement helps lower your brain activity and might lead to a better night's sleep. Okay. So let's talk about confounding. Confounding is one of these things that is really important, and it's one of those things that students tend to have a little bit of trouble identifying confounding. Okay, but confounding is just simply when the waters are kind of muddied here. Okay, we can't necessarily draw a clear cause and effect relationship because we don't know which thing might have caused that response. Okay, so confounding is when two variables are associated in a way that their effects on a response variable cannot be distinguished from each other. Okay, in other words, if there is more than one thing that could have caused that response, how do I know it was the first thing that caused the response or the second thing that caused the response? That's what confounding really is. Okay, it's when we can't draw that clear cause and effect relationship because even though we see the effect, we can't narrow down which thing caused it. Okay, so that's confounding. Confounding is when there is more things that could have caused the effect, and so we can't determine which cause is the thing that caused the effect that we're looking at. Okay, and so when we talk about that response and explanatory variable, it's when there could be multiple explanatory variables. Okay, so we look at that response variable and we say, I don't know which explanatory variable caused this to happen. Okay, that's what confounding really is. And if you want to make like a little note there and say, when we can't determine, so you cannot determine the thing that caused the effect. Okay, and that's the big thing. If there's more than one thing that could have caused the result that we're looking at, well, then that's confounding. If I can't narrow it down to one thing, I have confounding in this experiment. Okay. When we look at experiments, there's also a couple other things we have to look at. There's the treatment group, which is the condition applied to the individuals in an experiment. So when we talk about the treatment, it's what we did. In the previous example, it was that herbal supplement. Okay, so the herbal supplement was the treatment that we were having those students take before we measured their brain activity. Okay. A control group is just some kind of group that kind of provides a baseline. Okay, it gives us that ability to compare. All right, control groups are really important because we have to have some kind of comparison. We can't just assume that this is the baseline. Okay, that most students have this level of brain activity when they sleep. I need something for comparison. So like when we talk about like that herbal supplement and we saw lower brain activity, well, lower brain activity compared to what? There must be some kind of control group for us to compare that to. Okay. And the control group may or may not receive any treatment. Okay. Sometimes the control group is receiving a different treatment. Sometimes they are receiving no treatment. Okay, and so when you talk about the treatment is what we are giving them to see what the effect is. It's that explanatory variable within our experiment. The control group, yeah, they might just not have received that, and that's what we're using as baseline. Or they might be receiving an older treatment or a different treatment, so we can compare our new treatment and see if it causes a better effect. Okay. For example, and these are used in things like drug trials all the time. So a new drug is being tested to help patients with chronic headaches. Patients take a daily pill, but can still take acetaminophen as needed or Tylenol. Okay. So they're taking this new drug each day to see if it lowers the chronic headaches. So getting headaches all the time. And but if they do get a headache, they're still allowed to take Tylenol in order to treat their symptoms. Okay. So we want to explain how can confounding, how that might affect our the interpretation of our data. And so if these patients are coming to us and saying, okay, I've certainly experienced less headaches, I wasn't having as much of an issue, yada, yada, yada. Well, how do we know that it's our new drug that's causing that? Or if it's the fact that they're still taking a drug that is known to alleviate headache symptoms, which is the acetaminophen, the Tylenol, okay? And so it's difficult for us to determine if it's the new drug or if it's the acetaminophen that's causing them to have less headaches. Okay. And so when we talk about confounding here, the big issue is I can't tell which drug is helping them. Is it our new drug that they're taking the daily pill, or is it the old drug that they've been taking for their headaches, taking that Tylenol? Okay. So you cannot determine whether the new drug or the or the acetaminophen is causing the response. And so that's the idea. That's what confounding is. Confounding means I cannot narrow down the cause that has produced this response, that has produced this effect. Okay. The cause could be our new drug, and that's what's making this thing work. or it could be the acetaminophen. And so because I can't tell which one it is, this is an issue of confounding, okay? And so then the question is, how can how would a control group help us to reduce or eliminate confounding? Well, there's a couple things we could do. We could either have a control group where basically one group just takes acetaminophen and one group only takes the new drug. Or we could just say, hey, there's a control group where they're not allowed to take acetaminophen. They should only be taking our new drug. And so, like, if the results from the group that was taking our new drug and still allowed to take acetaminophen are the same as the group who's just taking our new drug, then we can kind of eliminate the acetaminophen as the thing that's causing the response. Okay. So a control group would be maybe like creating a group that takes the new drug but is not allowed to take acetaminophen. Okay. So the new drug only. And if they're only taking the new drug and they're still reporting reduced headaches, well, now we can kind of confirm that it's our drug that's causing that to happen. So our new drug is causing the effect and not necessarily the acetaminophen. See, we have to draw a distinction between these. We want to eliminate confounding in order to determine if our results are valid. Okay. And then this one, explain how confounding might affect how the results are interpreted. So in a study, so this is an observational study this time, in a study of more than 4,700 children, researchers found that children whose mothers smoked during pregnancy were twice as likely to develop ADHD. Okay. And again, because this is an observational study, we cannot draw a conclusion that smoking during pregnancy causes ADHD. And one of the big reasons why is because with the observational studies, we have a huge lack of control over things, and there's typically lots and lots of confounding. And so when you think about confounding in this situation, well, how in the world do we know it's the mother smoking during pregnancy that causes the ADHD? Okay. We haven't looked at any other data. Okay. And there's all kinds of things that might have caused this. Like there could be genetic factors that we ignored because we were only looking at smoking during pregnancy. Okay. We can look at diet. We can look at exercise. We can look at environmental factors. So there's a lot of other things that we kind of ignored when we looked at these, when we did this observational study. We only looked at a very specific variable and we ignored a lot of other things. Okay. So in terms of a confounding, there are all kinds of other factors that might have affected this thing. Okay. Let's say there are other factors which may be linked to ADHD. Okay. And a couple of those, some examples of those other factors would just be simply genetics. Okay. Maybe there's a genetic link between uh, parents and their children in terms of ADHD. Maybe it had something to do with the woman's diet while she was pregnant or the exercise levels. Okay. In terms of, because again, all those things affect like chemical balances and that kind of thing inside the body. So how do we know that that's not causing these things or environmental factors? There's just simply too many other things that could be the root cause of this, and we are not looking at those things when we do an experiment. Okay. And so confounding is this issue of, can I narrow down that this is absolutely the thing that has caused this response, that has caused this result? And with this particular example, there's no way we can draw that conclusion. Okay. Because there are so many other factors that could have caused the response, and we did not even limit or find a way around those things. Okay. Because the scope of this is so broad, and this is always the case with observational studies, there's always other things that could have had an effect, which is why we don't draw conclusions with observational studies. This just tells us, hey, there might be a link here, so maybe I should conduct an experiment that would narrow down this as the root cause. Okay. And so again, observational studies, we just take in data on what is naturally happening. experiments, we are imposing some kind of treatment, okay? The explanatory variable is what may have caused that response. The response variable is what we end up observing in the end, okay? And then that idea of confounding is when we cannot narrow down which essentially explanatory variable is the cause of this response variable, okay?